The water was not supposed to breathe, but Cecilia Moonvale heard it anyway. A slow, shuddering inhale, rising from beneath the ceremonial pool, followed by a child's voice, so small, it barely disturbed the surface. "Please, don't let him seal me inside again." No one else in the Tide Crown chamber heard it. Not the noble Luna candidates glowing beneath their moonlit veils, not the rival alphas watching from the balconies above, hungry for any excuse to call the Stormvale reign unstable. Not even Nathaniel Stormvale himself, the Tide Alpha King, a man so composed that court legend claimed the sea itself obeyed his silence. Cecilia was not supposed to be there. She was a mapmaker, an archivist, a quiet girl from an inland pack who had spent her whole life being told that the voices she heard in water were not real. But this voice was real, and it was terrified. So she pressed her palm to a wall of black coral, and the coral bit back, and one drop of her blood fell into water that had been sealed for 3 centuries. The pool did not ripple, it breathed, and somewhere above her, a king who had never lost control of anything in his life, lifted his head, inhaled once, and forgot every vow he had sworn to protect his crown. If a story has ever made your chest ache the way this one is about to, if you've ever wanted someone to choose you, not because fate demanded it, but because they simply couldn't imagine choosing anyone else, then you already understand why I need you here for this one. Stay until the end. Comment the moment your heart breaks for Cecilia, because it will. And if you believe love should be a choice and not a chain, hit subscribe now, because that is the entire soul of this story. Now, let the tide rise. Mooncrest Castle did not sit beside the sea. It grew from it. Its towers had been carved directly into black cliffs where an ancient inland lake, Moonvale Lake, met something far older and far less explainable. A supernatural undercurrent the coastal packs simply called the deep. Torches burned blue near the water, not gold, because ordinary fire refused to hold its color so close to the tide magic pulsing beneath the stone. Cecilia Moonvale had arrived 4 days earlier as part of the White Howl Pack's peace delegation, carrying maps instead of weapons, ink-stained fingers instead of claws, bared for negotiation. She was 24, sharp-eyed, and accustomed to being the quietest person in every room she entered. A survival skill, not a personality. She told herself she had only come to observe the Tide Crown Rite from the outer gallery, the way any properly behaved guest would. She told herself the pull she felt toward the ceremonial chamber was curiosity, nothing more. She was lying to herself, and she knew it the moment she heard the child's voice for the first time. It had started 3 nights earlier, faint and fractured, drifting up through the castle's ancient plumbing whenever moonlight touched still water. At first, she thought exhaustion was playing tricks on her nerves. She had learned, painfully, as a child in the White Howl Pack, that admitting she heard voices in water was the fastest way to be looked at, like something broken. One prediction had come true once. She had been 9 years old, warning the pack elders about a flood that arrived exactly as she described it 3 days later, and instead of gratitude, she had received isolation, wary glances, doors that no longer opened easily to her knock. She learned, in the cruelest way a child can learn anything, that being believed was more dangerous than being ignored. So when the voice grew louder inside Mooncrest Castle, she did what she had trained herself to do for 15 years. She stayed silent. She stayed unnoticed. Until the night of the rite, when the voice stopped being faint, "Please don't let him seal me inside again." It came from directly beneath the ceremonial pool, the heart of the Tide Crown chamber, the one place in the entire castle absolutely forbidden to outsiders during the ritual. Cecilia stood frozen in the gallery corridor, gripping the stone rail hard enough to whiten her knuckles, while below her, the the court gathered for a ceremony that occurred only once every 30 years, or after the death of a Tide ruler. She knew the punishment for trespassing during a sealed rite: imprisonment, if the court was merciful; execution, if it was not. She went anyway. Nathaniel Stormvale stood at the center of the Tide circle, in ceremonial black and silver, and even from a distance, Cecilia could see why every account of him described the same word: controlled. He was 31, broad-shouldered beneath armor etched with wave patterns older than the current dynasty, his dark hair damp from the ritual cleansing all Tide Alphas underwent before the crown was placed. His expression gave away nothing. Not pride, not nerves, not even the faint irritation most men might show at being watched by 3 rival packs simultaneously. He had survived 2 assassination attempts before he turned 25. He had put down a pack rebellion without losing a single soldier. He had spent a decade resisting a hereditary madness called the Deep Hunger that had already claimed his mother's mind and, eventually, her life. Nothing rattled Nathaniel Stormvale. Tonight, he was meant to complete 3 sacred duties at once: renew the ancient wards, sealing the boundary between the living world and the drowned realm; formally confirm Celine Blackthorn, daughter of the powerful Blood Moon Pack, as his political Luna; and reaffirm the Coastal Pack's mutual defense oath before witnesses from every allied territory. Celine stood inside the glowing Tide circle beside 2 other Luna candidates, poised in pale ceremonial silk, her chin lifted with the practiced calm of a woman who had been raised since childhood to understand that marriage and governance were the same duty wearing different names. She did not love Nathaniel, she respected him, and she believed, genuinely, without cynicism, that their union was the only thing capable of preventing a war that would otherwise consume the coast. The Tide Council chanted the opening verses. One by one, each Luna candidate stepped forward to receive the pool's blessing, and one by one, the water dimmed rather than brightened at their touch, refusing to fully acknowledge any of them. Murmurs of unease moved through the gallery. Older nobles exchanged glances that suggested this had never happened in living memory. No one in the chamber understood why. Most assumed it meant the wards themselves were already dying, or that no woman present was fit to stand beside a king. The truth, that the Rite had not rejected the candidates at all, but had simply been waiting for someone the water itself remembered, would not surface for weeks. The sea beat rhythmically against the cliffs below, as though counting down, and beneath the ceremonial pool, hidden behind a jagged wall of black coral that had scarred the palms of nobles for 300 years, Cecilia Moonvale pressed herself into the shadows and listened to a child beg her not to leave.
"I'm here,"
she whispered, so quietly that even she barely heard herself. "I'm here. I won't let him seal you in." She had no plan, she had no weapon, no rank, no right to be anywhere near this chamber. She had only the unbearable, familiar ache of a voice no one else could hear, calling to her the way voices always had, and the unbearable, unfamiliar decision to finally answer one. And the coral cut her palm before she even realized she had reached for it, a shard as sharp as a blade catching her skin as she braced herself against the wall. She hissed, more startled than hurt, and pressed her hand instinctively to her side. But a single drop had already fallen, into the ceremonial pool, into water sealed by ritual, protected by blood law, forbidden to any hand but a crowned Tide Alphas. The chamber did not explode into chaos. It was quieter than that, and far more terrifying. The pool rose, not spilled, not splashed. Rose in defiance of gravity, a slow column of moonlit water lifting itself toward the ceiling, as though something ancient beneath its surface had finally, after 3 centuries, been permitted to exhale. The chanting stopped mid-verse. Every noble in the gallery turned toward the water, and at the center of the tide circle, the crown slipped from Nathaniel Stormvale's hand and struck the stone floor with a sound like a funeral bell. His eyes had turned sea green. He had felt many things in his 31 years of rule: rage, grief, the cold discipline of command, but he had never felt anything arrive inside his chest like this. A scent. Not perfume, not smoke, not salt. Something underneath all of it, something that made his wolf surge forward with a violence he had spent a lifetime learning to suppress. Find her. The thought was not his own, not entirely. It belonged to the wolf, the primal half of him that had never once, in 3 decades, spoken with such certainty. Find her, now. He turned away from Celine without a word of explanation. He turned away from the council, the crown lying forgotten on the stone, the entire assembled political future of the coastal packs, arranged like carefully balanced dominoes behind him, and every single one of them fell the instant he took his first step toward the coral wall. The ceremonial wolves guarding the chamber's threshold, ancient stone effigies enchanted to bow only before a crowned alpha, dipped their carved heads toward Cecilia's hiding place instead. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Somewhere behind him, Celine's composure cracked audibly. A sharp inhale, quickly hidden. Nathaniel did not look back. He walked directly toward the trembling, blood-marked stranger, crouched behind the black coral. And every instinct honed by 3 decades of iron discipline screamed the same single command: protect her. Whatever this costs, protect her. Cecilia saw him emerge from behind the coral wall, like something summoned rather than walked. Tall, broad, his sea-green eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the air in her lungs feel suddenly too thin to breathe. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low, rough, stripped of the composed authority the entire court had just watched him abandon, in front of 2 rival alphas and his intended bride. "I know," Cecilia whispered. "Why does the water know you?" "I don't." She stopped. Behind her, faint and fading now that her blood had touched the pool, the child's voice whispered one final aching plea before falling silent. "Thank you." Cecilia's eyes burned. "There's a child down there," she said, her voice cracking. "Trapped. She's been trapped for years. I couldn't just..." She swallowed hard. "I couldn't just let her stay alone." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Not softening exactly, but a crack forming in the composed mask he wore like armor. For one unguarded moment, the king of the Stormclaw pack looked less like a ruler and more like a man staring at something he could not explain and did not want to lose. Behind them, the tide guard finally moved, closing in with weapons half drawn, unsure whether to protect their king or restrain the woman who had just shattered the most sacred ceremony in Stormvale history. Nathaniel placed himself between Cecilia and his own soldiers, without a flicker of hesitation. "No one touches her," he said, and his voice carried the full, terrible weight of a king who had just, in front of his entire court, chosen a stranger over his crown. Above them, the ceremonial water surged once more, casting long blue shadows across the walls, as though the sea itself was waiting to see what he would do next. Somewhere in the gallery, Celine Blackthorn stood perfectly still, watching her carefully arranged future dissolve in front of 3 rival packs, and said nothing at all. The Tide Crown Rite was broken. The wards had not been renewed. And a king who had never lost control of anything in his life had just lost all of it, in a single breath, for a woman whose name he did not even know yet. By dawn, the entire coast knew what had happened at Mooncrest Castle. Cecilia was not thrown into a cell, though half the court demanded it. She was placed under guarded protection in a tower room overlooking the Black Cliffs. a distinction that meant little to her until she understood the reason behind it. Twice, when a nervous guard had gripped her arm too tightly on the walk up the stairs, the water in the corridor's fountain had surged violently against its basin, as if in warning. The wards did not trust anyone who threatened her, not even the king's own men. 12 guards for one mapmaker? Ronan Ironclaw, commander of the Tide Guard, said dryly, leaning against the doorframe of the tower room, with his arms crossed, and an expression that suggested he found the entire situation both alarming and quietly amusing. "The castle is unsafe," Nathaniel said, standing a few feet from Cecilia, with the rigid posture of a man determined not to get any closer than duty required. "For her?" Ronan asked. "Or for anyone who speaks to her?" Nathaniel did not answer that. Cecilia, seated on the edge of a narrow bed, with her knees drawn up, and her cut palm bandaged in white howl linen, allowed herself the smallest flicker of dry humor, despite the terror still tightening her chest. "I promise I'm not dangerous," she said. "You broke a 300-year-old rite with one drop of blood," Ronan said. "Forgive me if I reserve judgment." The interrogation, when it came, took place in a chamber lined with seawater channels running along the floor, a room Cecilia would later learn was designed specifically to unsettle anyone attempting to lie inside it. Nathaniel stood across from her, arms folded. His sea-green eyes returned now to their usual dark blue, though something restless still moved behind them. "Why did the water answer your blood?" he asked. "I don't know," Cecilia admitted. "It's always answered me. Voices in wells, rivers, old floodplains on maps I shouldn't have been able to read as clearly as I do." She met his gaze, steadier now than she had been the night before. "I didn't come here to interrupt your rite, Your Grace. I came because a child was crying, and no one else could hear her. Do you understand what you cost me?" "I understand what you chose," she said, before she could stop herself. "You dropped the crown. I didn't make you do that." Something tightened along his jaw. For a long moment he said nothing, and Cecilia realized she had just accused a king, aloud, of losing control of himself, and that the accusation was infuriatingly true. "Did you abandon the rite because you wanted to?" she asked quietly, "or because your wolf ordered you to?" He did not answer. He couldn't, and the silence between them stretched long enough that Cecilia understood, with a small and unwelcome jolt beneath her ribs, that the question had unsettled him far more than any accusation of treason could have. The Blood Moon delegation was less patient than their king. Within a day, an elder of Celine's household stood before the Tide Council and demanded Cecilia's execution, calling her a spellcaster who had deliberately seduced the king away from his sworn duty using forbidden Tidekeeper magic, a bloodline the court had believed extinct for 3 centuries. "She is a mapmaker from an inland pack," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying easily across the council hall, flat and final. "No one touches her without proof of guilt." It was not a declaration of love. It was, deliberately, nothing more than the bare minimum a king owed any guest under threat within his walls. But Celine, seated with rigid dignity at the edge of the chamber, watched the way his eyes moved to the tower windows every few minutes, as if some invisible thread kept pulling his attention toward a woman he had known for less than 2 days, and she understood, long before Cecilia did, exactly what she was witnessing. The ward maps told a different story than the court wanted to hear. 2 days after the broken rite, Cecilia was brought, reluctantly and under guard, to the castle's map archive to examine the ceremonial wards for irregularities the Tide Council's own scholars had missed. It was, Ronan admitted grudgingly, the only reason Nathaniel had managed to keep her alive through 2 separate council votes. She found the missing runes within an hour. These sections weren't damaged by your rite, she said, tracing a finger along a corridor of ink that ran beneath the tide-crowned chamber, matching it against the failing wards charted on an older, dust-covered map. They were already incomplete. Someone removed the anchoring symbols months ago. Maybe longer. Nathaniel went very still beside her. You're certain. The ink layers don't match. Whoever did this was careful, but not careful enough to fool someone who reads maps for a living. She looked up at him. Your Grace, someone sabotaged this rite long before I ever touched that water. For the first time since the ceremony, Nathaniel Stormvale looked at Cecilia Moonvale, not as a scandal, not as a threat, and not as the woman his wolf had chosen without his permission, but as someone whose mind might be the only thing standing between his coast and a war neither of them had started. Then we find out who, he said, before they finish what they started. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, how close they were standing. Neither of them noticed the faint hum of resonance beginning to build in the small space between their hands. But beneath the castle, in tunnels no living Stormvale had walked in 3 centuries, something ancient stirred, patient, hungry, and finally, after 300 years of silence, no longer entirely alone. The submerged archive lay 3 levels beneath the castle, accessible only through a flooded stairwell that required both a Stormvale escort and a strong set of lungs. Nathaniel led Cecilia down himself, torch raised, water lapping at their knees by the time they reached the sealed doors. No one's opened this chamber in a generation, he said, pressing his palm to a rune that glowed faintly blue at his touch. My mother used to say, the sea keeps its oldest secrets underwater on purpose, so only the desperate go looking. Are we desperate? Cecilia asked. We broke a sacred rite in front of 3 rival packs, and now half the coast wants a war, Nathaniel said. I'd say we qualify. The doors opened onto a chamber lined with waterlogged scrolls and coral-encrusted tablets, preserved by old magic against the passage of centuries. Cecilia's breath caught the moment she stepped inside. Not from the beauty of it, though it was beautiful, all soft blue light filtering through water-glass ceilings, but from the sound. The whole room was humming, faintly, like a held breath. The Moonvale Tidekeepers, she read aloud from the first tablet her fingers touched, translating the old coastal script with the same instinct she used for ancient territorial maps. Guardians of the boundary, between the living world and the drowned realm. She looked up at Nathaniel. That's my family name. I know, he said quietly. I recognized it the moment you spoke it in the tower. I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain what it meant yet. And now? Now I think your bloodline is the reason the water listens to you. And I think my bloodline is the reason it's dying. Further in, on a tablet so old its edges had softened to sand beneath centuries of water, Cecilia found the original structure of the Tide Crown Rite, and the answer to a question the whole court had been asking since the night of the broken ceremony. The rite had never been designed to confirm a Stormvale's chosen bride alone. It required 2 hands on the crown at once, a Stormvale guardian and a Moonvale tidekeeper standing beside them as witness and anchor. Without a tidekeeper present, the water had no second authority to answer to, which was why, generation after generation, it had quietly refused every Luna candidate ever presented to it, dimming instead of blessing, exactly as it had dimmed for Celine and the others days earlier. It wasn't rejecting them for being unworthy, Cecilia said slowly, understanding arriving with the weight of a stone dropping. It was rejecting an incomplete rite. It's been waiting 300 years for a tidekeeper to walk back into that chamber. Nathaniel stared at the tablet for a long moment. Then the water wasn't punishing anyone the night you came in, he said. It was finally being asked correctly. They spent the following days in uneasy, necessary partnership. investigating flooded tunnels beneath the castle, cross-referencing corrupted ward maps against the fragments preserved in the archive, building something that neither of them named yet, because naming it felt like admitting how quickly mutual suspicion had softened into something far more dangerous. "Careful," Nathaniel said, one afternoon, catching Cecilia's arm as loose stones shifted beneath her boot in a tunnel that hadn't been reinforced in decades. His hand lingered half a second longer than duty required before he released her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging what neither could explain. A pull that had nothing to do with the mate bond humming quietly beneath both their ribs, and everything to do with the small, ordinary moments accumulating between them. The way he listened, fully, when she spoke, as though her observations carried weight, independent of her bloodline. The way she challenged him without flinching, as though his crown had never once intimidated her, the way it intimidated everyone else in his life. "Was that an order?" she asked him once, when he'd instructed, rather forcefully, that she not investigate a flooded corridor alone. "A request," he said. "You should practice," she said, arching an eyebrow. They sound remarkably similar. For the first time since the Rite, Nathaniel Stormvale laughed. A short, surprised sound, as though he'd forgotten he still had the capacity for it. But not every discovery in the archive brought them closer. Some pulled them apart. Buried among fragments describing Tidekeeper history, Cecilia found a passage that made her blood run cold, an account describing how the last Tidekeepers, centuries ago, had once used ritual blood binding to manufacture wolf recognition between chosen pairs, forcing bonds for political convenience rather than allowing them to form naturally. She read it 3 times before she looked up at Nathaniel, her voice barely a whisper. "What if this isn't real? What if I'm not your mate at all? What if my bloodline just made you think I was? Cecilia, what if I was made to be a weapon against you, and I don't even know it?" Her hands were trembling now, an old fear rising in her chest, sharper than anything the court's hostility had provoked. She had spent her whole life terrified that anyone who valued her only wanted her for what she could do, and here, suddenly, was proof that her own ancestors might have built exactly that kind of danger into her blood. "I need distance," she said, backing toward the archive doors. "I need to think without," she gestured helplessly between them, "without whatever this is influencing me." Nathaniel did not follow her. It cost him more than she would ever know to let her walk away. But he understood, with a clarity that surprised even himself, that chasing her now would only prove her fear correct. "Then take it," he said quietly. "I won't stop you." She left, and for the first time since the Rite, the ache in Nathaniel's chest had nothing to do with his wolf at all. That night, alone in his private chambers, Nathaniel made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. He walked to the ancient bond silencing chamber, buried beneath the throne room. A room built centuries ago to suppress supernatural instinct entirely, used only in cases of alpha madness or forced separation from a dangerous bond. He had never once needed to use it in 31 years of resisting the deep hunger. He stepped inside anyway. The moment the door sealed, the constant low hum of recognition he'd felt since the Rite went completely, jarringly silent. No pull, no scent, no wolf whispering "find her" in the back of his mind. Just Nathaniel, alone with his own thoughts, for the first time in days. And still, without a single supernatural instinct urging him forward, he found himself thinking of her anyway. Her stubbornness, her courage, the particular way she'd looked at the crown as though it meant nothing compared to a stranger's cry for help beneath a forbidden pool. He thought of her dry wit, sharpened by years of hiding, and the loneliness beneath it, that mirrored something in himself he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. He wanted her. Not his wolf. Him. He left the chamber and found her in the tower before dawn, still awake, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the black water. I went into the silencing chamber, he told her. I felt nothing. No bond, no scent, no instinct telling me to find you. Cecilia turned, wary. And? I still wanted to be here, he said simply. I still chose you. If the bond disappeared tomorrow, I would still choose you. He held her gaze, steady, despite the vulnerability plain across his face. A vulnerability he had spent 31 years learning never to show anyone. I won't take anything you don't choose to give freely, not because of scent, not because of fate, only if it's real. Something in Cecilia's chest, guarded for 15 years against exactly this kind of promise, cracked open. I'm not ready to trust it yet, she whispered. Then I'll wait, Nathaniel said, for as long as it takes. It was not a declaration of love, but it was, perhaps, more powerful than one. A king surrendering certainty for patience, choosing her freedom over his own comfort. Neither of them noticed the shadow retreating from the corridor outside, nor the quiet, calculating satisfaction on Alaric Frostbane's face as he disappeared into the dark, already planning how to use his nephew's unguarded heart against him. 2 days later, a familiar face arrived from the White Howl Pack. Adrian Hawthorne, one of Cecilia's oldest friends among the delegation's escort, sent to check on her welfare after word of the broken Rite reached her home pack. You don't have to stay here, Adrian told her quietly, in the tower's small garden overlooking the cliffs, his tone gentle and entirely without agenda, beyond genuine concern. The elders would welcome you home. No one there would question your loyalty the way this court does. I know, Cecilia said, but there's still a mystery here I haven't solved, and people who need what I can do. Adrian studied her for a moment, then smiled, a little sadly. It's him, isn't it? Not the mystery. Cecilia didn't answer, which was answer enough. Nathaniel found them a few minutes later, ostensibly to discuss the day's council schedule, though the way his gaze fixed on Adrian's proximity to Cecilia made his true purpose plain enough to anyone watching. His wolf, still raw from days of forced restraint, surged with a possessiveness he had to consciously smooth out of his expression before he spoke. He did not forbid her from leaving. He did not order Adrian from the garden, though every instinct urged him to. Instead, he waited until Adrian excused himself, and then said the only thing that mattered. You could go home, he said quietly, none of his usual command in the words. I wouldn't stop you. I wouldn't even blame you. He paused. But I'm asking you to stay, not because the wards need you, because I do. It was, Cecilia realized, the most vulnerable sentence she had ever heard a king speak. No authority behind it at all. Only honest, unguarded want. She found she didn't need to think very long before answering. I was already staying, she said. I just wanted to see if you'd ask. The forced proximity came from disaster rather than design. Investigating a tunnel collapse near the old smuggling routes, Cecilia and Nathaniel found themselves trapped together in a small air pocket as seawater rose steadily around them, the only way out blocked by fallen rock that would take hours to clear. We need to conserve warmth, Nathaniel said, professional and careful, though his voice had gone rougher than the situation strictly required. The water's cold enough to be dangerous. That's not an excuse to get closer to me, is it, Your Grace? Cecilia asked, teeth chattering despite her attempt at humor. Would it work if it were? Maybe. He pulled her carefully against his side, asking permission with his eyes before his hands ever moved, and she let him. Grateful for warmth she told herself was only about survival. His arms around her felt like something neither of them had words for yet. Steady, careful, deliberately restrained despite the way his wolf screamed at him to hold her closer. When rescue finally broke through hours later, neither of them moved away as quickly as propriety demanded. That evening, exhausted and still shaking off the cold, Cecilia reached up and touched Nathaniel's face, tracing the line of his jaw as though needing physical proof he had survived the collapse alongside her. He leaned toward her, close enough that she felt his breath against her lips, then stopped, pulling back with visible effort. "I won't take anything the bond might be pressuring you to give," he murmured. "Not like this. Not when you're still afraid of what it means." The restraint cost him everything it looked like it cost him, and it was, more than any kiss could have been, the exact proof Cecilia needed that whatever grew between them was worth trusting. Maeve Ravenswood had a talent for finding things people wanted hidden. Cecilia's closest friend from the White Howl delegation, Maeve was outspoken where Cecilia was cautious, socially fearless where Cecilia preferred shadows, and utterly relentless once she caught the scent of a lie in a ledger. She had spent the week since the broken Rite quietly reviewing Mooncrest trade records, and what she found made her blood run cold. "Payments," she told Cecilia, spreading a set of documents across the tower table with the grim satisfaction of someone who wished she'd been wrong. "Routed through 3 shell accounts, all leading back to smugglers in the Nightfall Pack. Someone inside this castle has been paying to have relics removed from the coastal wards for over a year." "Who?" Maeve hesitated. "The signature's disguised, but the seal on the final payment, it's a Stormvale household seal, not Nathaniel's." Cecilia's stomach dropped. There was only one other Stormvale with that authority. Ronan's own investigation, running parallel and unknowingly toward the same conclusion, uncovered missing guard rotation records from the night of the Rite. Evidence that the black coral wall Cecilia had hidden behind should have been under constant watch, and wasn't. "Someone cleared the guards from that corridor," Ronan told Nathaniel grimly. "Deliberately, before the ceremony even began." "Who had that authority?" Ronan's silence answered the question before he spoke it aloud. "Only you, or your uncle." Celine Blackthorne confirmed the truth before either Cecilia or Nathaniel fully understood what they were looking at. Maeve's shell accounts had traced the smuggling payments as far as a disguised household seal. Proof of guilt, but not yet proof of identity. It was Celine, drawing on the kind of formal court access no White Howl visitor had ever been granted, who matched that seal against the private correspondence archive of every noble family with standing in Mooncrest. Motivated, at first, by nothing nobler than suspicion that someone was manipulating the political landscape to her disadvantage, she found what Maeve's ledgers alone could never have proven. The disguised seal on every payment belonged, unmistakably, to Alaric Frostbane's private household. She had every reason to bury the evidence. Exposing it would not restore her broken engagement, would not undo the public humiliation she'd suffered in front of 3 rival packs. A crueler woman might have used the discovery as leverage, or let the coast burn out of wounded pride. Instead, she went to Nathaniel directly. "Maeve's ledgers found the money," she told him, sliding the household correspondence across his desk without ceremony. "I found whose seal was hiding behind it. Your uncle has been buying relics from the Nightfall smugglers, ward anchors, old Tidekeeper artifacts. He's been removing pieces of the ward's foundation for over a year, Nathaniel. Long before that girl ever set foot in Mooncrest." Nathaniel stared at the evidence in silence for a long moment. "Why bring this to me? You'd have every right to let this destroy me." "Because I actually believe in peace on this coast," Celine said, with quiet dignity, "even if it isn't built the way I once imagined it. And because," she paused, something almost gentle crossing her composed features, "because whatever's happening between you and that mapmaker, it's real. I've watched enough political marriages to recognize the difference. Don't waste it protecting the wrong person's secrets. There was more. Tucked among the same household papers, Celine had found something she almost hadn't recognized for what it was. A set of marginal notes in Alaric's own hand, correcting an official court translation of the submerged archive's oldest Tidekeeper tablet. The very passage that had once described blood binding used to manufacture wolf recognition. The passage that had sent Cecilia fleeing the archive in fear that her bond with Nathaniel was nothing but a weapon built into her blood. Your uncle didn't just remove ward anchors, Celine said, laying the notes beside the original. He rewrote history while he was at it. The true tablet describes something else entirely. Temporary ritual pairings, arranged marriages, sealed with a few drops of blood, so two rival packs could pretend at loyalty for a season. Never a true bond, never anything like what a mate recognition actually is. He changed 3 words in the official translation, and it was enough to make her doubt something real. When Nathaniel brought the corrected translation to Cecilia that evening, she read it twice, her hands trembling for a different reason now. He wanted me to doubt you, she said quietly, so I'd never trust what my own instincts already knew. He almost succeeded, Nathaniel said, but you didn't need the bond to convince you I meant what I said in that silent room. You just needed to know the fear itself was manufactured, not the feeling underneath it. Something in Cecilia finally settled, quiet and certain, in a way no ritual or bloodline had ever managed to give her. The truth arrived fully when Cecilia, with Nathaniel beside her, returned to the tide pool, where the child's voice had first called to her weeks ago. Using a fragment of resonant coral from the submerged archive, she attempted something she had never dared before, reaching into the water not merely to listen, but to release whatever spirit remained trapped beneath its surface. The water rose again, gentler this time, and within it formed the faint, translucent shape of a small girl no older than 6, her eyes the same sea green as Nathaniel's. Nathaniel went completely white. "Leora," he whispered. "You remember me," the spirit said, her voice carrying both wonder and old grief. "I wasn't sure you would," he said. "You wouldn't. You died as an infant," Nathaniel said, his voice breaking on every word. "I was told." "He lied to you," Leora said. "Uncle Alaric. He sacrificed me during a failed ward renewal, when I was 6, not an infant. He said it would delay the deep hunger. He said it would protect you." Her small translucent hand reached toward her brother, unable to touch him. "And when it worked, when the corruption slowed, he used tide magic to erase your memory of me, to erase everyone's memory. He didn't want you to grieve a sister who might make you doubt him." Something in Nathaniel's control, held rigid for 31 years, finally began to fracture. "Our mother," he said, his voice raw. "Did she know?" "She found out," Leora said softly. "That's why she tried to destroy the crown. She learned the truth about the Tidekeeper massacre, how our ancestors slaughtered the guardians, who once kept this coast safe, and stole their power for themselves. She realized the deep hunger wasn't natural madness. It was punishment. Corruption from stolen magic, passed down bloodline to bloodline, growing heavier with every generation that refused to give it back. She didn't walk into the sea willingly, Nathaniel said. It wasn't a question. Uncle Alaric forced her, Leora whispered. Before she could expose him, he told everyone she succumbed to madness. She didn't. She was trying to save you, and it cost her everything. Cecilia watched Nathaniel Stormvale, a man who had survived assassinations, rebellions, and 31 years of controlled, disciplined restraint, break apart in front of her, grief and fury tearing through him in equal measure. She reached for his hand without thinking, and he gripped it like a man drowning gripping the only solid thing left in the world. His wolf surged violently beneath his skin, the deep hunger stirring at the edges of his control for the first time in years. "Nathaniel," Cecilia said, steady despite her own racing heart. "Stay with me. Don't let him take this from you too." Slowly, agonizingly, he pulled himself back from the edge, not because his instincts demanded it, but because her voice, her hand in his, gave him something worth staying present for. Alaric Frostbane learned of the confrontation within hours and moved with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had spent decades preparing contingencies for exactly this moment. He could not undo what Leora had revealed, but he could still control the narrative. Within a day, he had quietly convinced key members of the Tide Council that Cecilia herself had caused the ward collapse, now accelerating across the coast, twisting the truth just enough to be believable, framing her blood awakening of the pool as the true catalyst rather than his own year of careful sabotage. Rival alphas, already destabilized by the broken Rite, seized on the accusation eagerly. The Silver Fang Pack's alpha, once a steady ally, began openly questioning Nathaniel's judgment. Whispers of civil war moved through the coastal territories like a rising tide. "Surrender the girl," the council demanded, "or risk war with every pack that once trusted the Stormvale crown." Nathaniel refused outright, in front of the entire council, in a voice that left no room for negotiation. "I will not sacrifice an innocent woman to satisfy a lie my uncle constructed to protect himself." But Cecilia, watching the political fracture spreading through the coast because of her presence, made a decision of her own that night. One born not of fear, but of clear, deliberate strategy. "I have to go," she told Nathaniel, her bag already packed, her expression steady, despite the ache in her chest. "Not because I'm running, because there's a sanctuary hidden somewhere in the Moonvale territory, my family's true home. If there's evidence that can stop this war and expose Alaric completely, it's there. I can't find it hiding in a tower." Nathaniel wanted, more than he had wanted anything in his life, to forbid her from leaving. Instead, he made himself say the harder thing. "Then I'll make sure Ronan can hold the castle," he said, "and I'll come find you. Not because my wolf demands it, because I refuse to let you face this alone." She kissed him then. Soft, brief, entirely her own choice, untouched by scent, or bond, or fate, and walked out into the night, toward whatever truth waited for her, at the edge of the drowned realm. Behind her, the wards groaned, and somewhere beneath Mooncrest Castle, Alaric Frostbane smiled at the sound of a kingdom finally beginning to drown. The Moonvale Sanctuary lay hidden behind a waterfall no map, not even Cecilia's own careful hand-drawn charts, had ever accurately recorded. A deliberate omission, she realized, the moment she stepped through the hidden passage and felt the air itself shift into something older, heavier, achingly familiar. She was not alone inside. Cecilia, the voice belonged to a woman Cecilia had spent her entire life believing dead. Elena Moonvale stood at the center of the sanctuary's inner chamber, her form faintly translucent at the edges, tethered somewhere between the living world and the drowned realm beyond. "Mother? I entered the drowned realm voluntarily," Elena said, her voice thick with 16 years of longing. "The night I discovered how much of the ward's true foundation had already been hollowed out by 3 centuries of stolen Stormvale power. Even then, the seal was thin enough to fail on its own within your lifetime, Cecilia. I couldn't repair 300 years of decay, but I could hold back what waited on the other side, one drowned soul at a time, buying this coast the only thing it needed, time." 16 years, Cecilia whispered, tears sliding freely down her face. "You've been holding it back for 16 years. It's why the wards failed slowly for 16 years, instead of collapsing all at once," Elena said. "But what accelerated in this last year was different. deliberate. Someone has been prying anchor stones loose from the foundation itself, not waiting for the old decay to finish its work. I felt every one of them come free, faster than any natural failure should allow. Her expression darkened. That was never the ancient weakening. That was a hand reaching in on purpose. She reached toward her daughter, her translucent hand unable to fully touch her, yet Cecilia felt warmth anyway, faint and real. You've grown into exactly who I hoped you'd become, brave enough to answer a stranger's cry for help, stubborn enough to survive a court that wanted you silenced. That matches what Maeve and Celine found, Cecilia said grimly. Payments to Nightfall smugglers, going back a little over a year. Someone's been pulling ward anchors out of the foundation on purpose, right around the time you're describing. Then you already know who, Elena said quietly. I need your help, Cecilia said. The crown, the Tide Crown Rite, it was built on stolen Tidekeeper power. I don't know how to close the gate without repeating the same sacrifice that destroyed our family in the first place. Elena's expression sharpened. Then listen carefully, because you must understand this before you return. Closing the gate the old way, binding a single Tidekeeper to the deep gate as sacrifice, would only recreate the exact system that destroyed our ancestors. You cannot carry this alone. The gate can only close permanently if Nathaniel relinquishes the Tide Crown entirely, if every coastal alpha voluntarily contributes their own power to the wards, and if you choose to guide the ritual rather than sacrifice yourself to it. Will they agree to that? Give up power willingly? That, Elena said softly, will depend entirely on what kind of king Nathaniel Stormvale chooses to become. Nathaniel arrived at the sanctuary 2 days later, having delegated Mooncrest defense to Ronan with careful, deliberate instructions rather than abandoning his people out of desperate longing. It was, Cecilia noted the moment she saw him, a choice that told her everything about how far he had come since the night he'd dropped his crown for a stranger's scent. Their reunion was quiet, no dramatic declarations, no desperate embrace. Just his hand finding hers, and hers gripping back, both of them silently confirming what neither needed a bond to prove anymore. I love you, Cecilia told him, before either of them lost the courage to say it plainly. But I will not become another Tidekeeper, sacrificed to keep your throne standing. Then there will be no throne, Nathaniel said, without hesitation, if keeping it requires sacrificing you. They had barely finished speaking when the sanctuary's walls trembled, and far across the water, at Mooncrest Castle, the Alpha Summit Alaric had insisted upon convening, in Nathaniel's absence, reached its breaking point. Alaric Frostbane opened the deep gate himself. He did it in full view of the assembled rival Alphas, framing the act as an emergency measure forced upon him by Cecilia's earlier interference, a final, desperate lie meant to secure absolute authority over a coast he believed could only survive under total Stormvale control. The castle flooded from below. Water surged up through fountains, through mirrors, through every flooded corridor beneath Mooncrest, and from within it emerged drowned wolves, pale, hollow-eyed, driven by a hunger that had waited 3 centuries for release. Screams echoed through the hall of pack oaths, as noble delegates scattered in panic. Celine Blackthorn, rather than fleeing to safety with her own household guard, turned instead toward the terrified civilians trapped in the lower halls. This way, she shouted, her formal composure replaced by fierce, decisive command. Move, now. She led dozens to safety, through a service passage even the castle's own guards had forgotten existed. Ronan Ironclaw held the flooding tide tunnels with a handful of exhausted soldiers, buying precious minutes with nothing but sheer stubbornness and years of hard-won loyalty to a king who wasn't even present to see it. Maeve Ravenswood, cornered by two of Alaric's council allies, attempting to seize the moment for their own political advantage, produce the smuggling ledgers she'd hidden weeks earlier, and expose their complicity before the entire fleeing court, turning potential chaos into a fracture within Alaric's own conspiracy. And Nathaniel, arriving at the castle at a dead run alongside Cecilia, cutting through drowned wolves with a fury that came from grief as much as duty, felt the deep hunger finally break free of 31 years of careful restraint. His transformation began without his permission. Fur, claws, a partial shift into something far larger and more monstrous than his usual wolf form, the deep wolf, the final stage of the curse his mother had died trying to prevent. Celine, leading the last of the fleeing civilians through the service passage, paused only long enough to shout instructions to a group of terrified younger nobles who had frozen at the sight of the drowned wolves. "Move as one group, stay against the wall, do not run alone," she ordered, her voice carrying the same command she had spent a lifetime training for a throne she would never sit on, now spent instead on simply keeping people alive. Not one soul in her charge was lost that night. Ronan, blood running from a shallow claw wound along his forearm, held the narrowest of the tide tunnels with 3 remaining soldiers, forcing the drowned wolves into a bottleneck where sheer stubbornness mattered more than numbers. "Hold!" he bellowed, again and again, until his voice cracked, until reinforcements Maeve had rallied from the outer wall finally arrived to relieve them. "Nathaniel," Cecilia's voice cut through the chaos, steady, despite the drowned wolves closing around them. "Stay with me." But the curse was stronger now than it had ever been, fed by 3 centuries of stolen power finally reaching its terrible conclusion. And for the first time since she'd met him, Cecilia watched the king of the Stormclaw pack begin to disappear entirely into something he could no longer control. She had no time to reach her mother's sanctuary for guidance, no time to consult Tidekeeper lore for a careful, measured solution. She had only her voice, and the promise he had made her in a chamber where his wolf had gone completely silent. "You chose me when your wolf was silent," she said, gripping his monstrous, half-shifted claws in both her hands without flinching, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Choose me again, Nathaniel. Choose me now." For one terrible, endless moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the deep wolf's eyes, wild, sea-green, drowning in centuries of stolen madness, found hers, and recognized her, not through scent, not through instinct, but through the simple, stubborn memory of a promise made freely in a silent room. The transformation reversed, inch by painful inch, until Nathaniel Stormvale knelt in the flooded hall, human again, gasping, his hand still locked in hers. "The crown," he rasped. "Cecilia, we have to end this, now, before it takes me again." Behind them, wading through the flooded ruins of his own conspiracy toward the throne room, Alaric Frostbane began the final steps of the ritual he had spent a lifetime preparing to complete. They found Alaric Frostbane at the original Tidekeeper altar, deep beneath the throne room, standing before the deep gate as drowned water churned violently around his ankles. Nathaniel, his uncle's voice, carried the same paternal warmth it always had, as though the last decade of manipulation had never happened. "You're stronger than I hoped. The deep wolf nearly held you. A good sign. It means the power is ready to be claimed properly, at last." "You murdered my sister," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the devastation beneath it. "You drove my mother into the sea. You've spent a year sabotaging this coast's wards to force this exact moment." "I did what your mother lacked the strength to do," Alaric said, unflinching. "I protected this bloodline's authority." "Freedom creates chaos, Nathaniel. I watched war destroy my own family decades ago. I will not watch it destroy yours. Complete the old rite properly. Bind her." He gestured toward Cecilia without looking at her, as though she were a tool rather than a person. "To the gate, the way it was always meant to be done. Absolute control is the only thing that has ever kept this coast from tearing itself apart. And if I refuse, then the gate stays open," Alaric said simply, "and everyone in this castle drowns, including her. There's something else you should consider before you decide, nephew." Alaric's voice sharpened, aiming for the one place he knew could still wound. "The bond you two are so proud of was never separate from this crown. It was born from the same stolen power that built the wards. Break the crown, and you may well break the only thing tying that girl to you. She could wake tomorrow a stranger to you. Are you prepared to lose her freely, the way you're so eager to let her choose freely?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he did not look away from Cecilia. "Is that true?" he asked her quietly. "Could it end the bond?" "I don't know," Cecilia admitted, her voice unsteady, but her resolve untouched. "It might, but I would rather stand beside you as a stranger who chose you than stay bound to you by magic neither of us ever consented to." Nathaniel looked at Cecilia. Something passed between them, not through the bond, not through instinct, but through the same quiet understanding that had carried them from a hidden ceremony to this flooded altar. "All right," Nathaniel said, turning back to his uncle. "I'll complete the rite." Cecilia's breath caught, but she said nothing, trusting him, even as fear clawed at her chest. Alaric's expression eased into something almost triumphant as Nathaniel stepped forward, reaching for the ceremonial crown resting atop the ancient altar, restored, gleaming, waiting to complete the binding that would finally secure the Stormvale bloodline's stolen authority forever. Nathaniel lifted the crown from the altar. Then he turned and placed it directly into Cecilia's hands. "I, Nathaniel Stormvale, Tide Alpha King of the Stormclaw Pack," he said, his voice carrying through the flooded chamber with absolute clarity. "Renounce the crown and every authority stolen by my ancestors from the Moonvale Tidekeepers 3 centuries ago." "No." Alaric lunged forward, but the water surged violently between them, as though the sea itself had been waiting 300 years for exactly this declaration. "Now, Cecilia," Nathaniel said, "finish it." Cecilia Moonvale raised the crown that had cost her ancestors everything, and brought it down against the stone altar with every ounce of grief, fury, and hope she carried. The crown shattered. The curse tore through Nathaniel like a physical wound, 3 centuries of accumulated corruption ripping free of a bloodline that had carried it far too long. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, blood warmth draining visibly from his face, as the deep hunger fought its final, desperate battle against the will of the man who had chosen to end it. "Nathaniel," Cecilia dropped beside him, gripping his hands, terrified she had just watched him sacrifice his life for a truth he'd refused to abandon. Around them, the assembled coastal alphas, drawn to the throne room by the chaos, staring now at a crown broken beyond repair and a king stripped of absolute power, faced an impossible choice. Flee a coast now without its central authority, or share what remained of their own strength to close a gate none of them fully understood. Celine Blackthorn stepped forward first. "I'll contribute my pack's power," she said, without hesitation. "Not because duty demands it, but because I believe in what he just did." She looked at Cecilia. Both of them, one by one, the other alphas followed. The Silver Fang leader, reluctant allies from packs Nathaniel had never fully trusted, even distant representatives from packs that had spent generations resenting Stormvale authority, not out of fear, out of the rare, fragile hope that a coast built on voluntary oaths might finally succeed where 3 centuries of stolen power had failed. Cecilia guided their combined strength through the deep gate, her tidekeeper blood finally serving its true purpose, not as sacrifice, not as weapon, but as guide, exactly as her mother had promised. Elena and Leora's spirits, released at last from their long imprisonment between realms, passed through the closing gate with expressions of peace neither had known in years. The drowned wolves that had flooded through Mooncrest's corridors returned to rest, their centuries of restless hunger finally, mercifully ended. Alaric Frostbane, refusing until the last moment to release the corrupted power he had spent his entire life chasing, was consumed by it instead. The stolen magic he had never truly understood, turning on the man who had murdered a child and driven a grieving mother into the sea to protect it. The gate sealed. The wards renewed themselves, not through stolen power, but through the true, freely given strength of an entire coast finally choosing partnership over domination. In the days immediately following the gate's closing, the Coastal Council convened for the first time, without a crown presiding over it, and the debate that followed was neither smooth nor easy. Some alphas, accustomed to a single ruling authority, argued for a swift return to centralized power under whichever leader proved strongest in the crisis. Others, remembering exactly how that kind of power had been abused for 3 centuries, refused outright. It was Celine who proposed the compromise that finally held, a rotating council seat, shared authority over the ward's maintenance, and a permanent protected place for the Tidekeeper Order, answerable to no single pack. Ronan enforced order among the more volatile delegates with the same blunt patience he'd once used to manage Nathaniel's overprotective guard assignments. Maeve's ledgers, entered as formal evidence against Alaric's remaining allies on the council, ensured no one could quietly slide back into the old ways of doing things once the immediate crisis passed. It was not perfect. It was not even particularly graceful, but it was real, built by people who had chosen, freely, to trust each other with shared power, rather than surrender it to a single throne. And Nathaniel found he preferred its messy, hard-won stability to anything the old crown had ever offered him. And Nathaniel Stormvale, stripped of everything he had been raised to believe defined him, opened his eyes to find Cecilia Moonvale's face above his own, tears streaking her cheeks, her hands still locked tightly around his. "You're alive," she whispered. "I'm free," he said, and meant both things at once. It took hours for the flooded halls of Mooncrest to fully drain, and longer still for the surviving court to understand exactly what they had witnessed. A king who had willingly destroyed his own crown rather than let a single innocent life be traded for his throne's survival. By the time dawn broke over the black cliffs, the story had already begun spreading through the coastal packs, faster than any council decree could have managed, carried in the astonished, half-disbelieving voices of nobles who had watched it happen with their own eyes. Not everyone accepted it easily. A handful of Alaric's remaining sympathizers argued, briefly and without much conviction, that the coast now stood dangerously unguarded, without a single ruling alpha. But the drowned wolves had returned to rest. The wards held steady under shared power for the first time in 3 centuries, and the argument found little ground to stand on once the sun rose and the water stayed calm. Mooncrest Castle took months to fully recover from the flood, but the coast itself began healing far faster than anyone dared hope. A new coastal council formed in the crown's place, not a single alpha ruling through inherited fear, but a shared body of voluntary representatives from every allied pack, including, for the first time in 3 centuries, a restored seat for the Tidekeeper Order. Cecilia rebuilt it not as a bloodline of royal privilege, but as the independent institution her ancestors had always intended it to be. Guardians who protected the boundary because they chose to, not because a crown demanded their sacrifice. Nathaniel woke each morning without tide power humming beneath his skin, without the constant low awareness of Cecilia's presence that the mate bond had once carried effortlessly through his blood. For the first weeks, the silence unsettled him more than he admitted aloud, a lifetime of instinct, gone quiet. He assumed, more than once, that her freedom meant she might finally choose to leave. He never said so aloud. He had promised her patience, and he intended to keep that promise, even if it cost him everything a second time. He did not need to worry. She found him at dusk, beside Moonvale Lake, exactly 1 year to the day since the broken Rite, the water calm and silver beneath a rising moon. "The sea is silent," Cecilia told him, taking his hand without ceremony, without instinct guiding her, without anything but her own steady, deliberate will. "For the first time in my entire life, I don't hear a single voice in the water. Does that frighten you?" "No," she said, smiling for the first time in what felt like years without a trace of guardedness behind it. "It means I finally get to choose what I hear next." She turned to face him fully. "I choose you, Nathaniel. Not because a bond demanded it, not because fate arranged it, because you surrendered a crown for my freedom, and because you chose me in a silent room when nothing supernatural was telling you to." Slowly, softly, the bond returned between them, not as the violent, possessive recognition that had shattered a Rite a year earlier, but as something gentler, warmth, mutual recognition, a choice, freely made twice now by two people who had both learned, in their own painful ways, that love could not be commanded into existence. It could only be given. Their vow took place beside the lake days later, with only Ronan, Maeve, Celine, and the newly formed council present. No crown, no forced political alliance, no court watching from elevated balconies waiting to judge them. Just a mapmaker who had once believed being unnoticed was the only way to stay safe, and a king who had once believed love was a weakness his curse could exploit, choosing each other in the quiet, unremarkable, extraordinary way that people choose the person they intend to spend the rest of their lives beside. Celine, watching from beside the water, with an expression that held no trace of old bitterness, leaned toward Maeve, with the dry humor she'd only recently allowed herself to show. "They've been staring at each other for 10 minutes, she murmured, pretending to discuss coastal defense strategy. "He does not walk into rooms anymore," Maeve said, grinning. "He arrives like the room has personally been forgiven for offending him." Ronan, standing nearby with his arms crossed, and the faint, permanent smirk of a man who had watched his closest friend transform from an untouchable king into someone capable of this kind of open, unguarded happiness, simply shook his head. "Took him long enough," he said. "The deep hunger never returned. The curse, born from stolen power, had no bloodline left to poison, only a coast that had chosen, freely and together, to carry its own strength, instead of inheriting someone else's." Somewhere beneath Moonvale Lake, in water finally at peace after 3 centuries of grief, 2 spirits who had waited far too long for justice rested at last, watching over a coast rebuilt not on domination, but on truth. And on quiet evenings, when moonlight touched still water exactly right, Cecilia Moonvale could still hear the sea speak. Not in warning anymore, not in grief, but in something that sounded, unmistakably, like gratitude. If this story reached the part of you that has ever waited to be chosen for exactly who you are, not for what you can offer, not for what you can do, then you already understand why stories like this matter. Tell me in the comments which moment broke your heart the most. Was it Leora beneath the pool? The silent chamber? The crown breaking against the altar? Subscribe now, because there is another story waiting for you. Another impossible king. Another quiet woman the world underestimated. Another love worth staying up late for. Thank you for staying with Cecilia and Nathaniel until the very last wave of this story. If their journey moved you, if you believe, the way this story believes, that love should never be a cage but always a choice, then you are exactly the kind of listener these stories are written for. Until the next tide rises, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.